How are you, listeners? This is Tommy's Outdoors 63. Before you listen to this episode, I want to ask you a favor. To help me with the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating on the app or website where you are listening to me right now. And if you want to go the extra mile and help me even more, leave a review. And now, after having rated and left the review, please enjoy this episode of Tommy's Outdoors. Okay, with us today, Professor Thomas Cross, leading salmon scientist in the world. Tom, it's an honor to have you.
Thank you very much.
Listen, before we jump into the subject of salmons, how did it happen that you became salmon scientist? Was this something that you always interested in, and it was just meant to happen? Or if I travel back in time and meet 16-year-old you and say, like, you're gonna be salmon scientists, known in the world, and you go like, oh, you're a crazy guy from the future. Like, how did that happen?
Well, at the end of high school, I wanted to go into either medicine or biology. And I reckoned at that stage that I wouldn't be very happy dealing with patients. So I thought that other animals would be more interesting to deal with.
Is that it?
So I went to biology, and then in my second year in university, the summer of 1967, I got a summer bursary working on salmon disease with the head of department then, and got to see a lot of the rivers, the Blackwater and the Bandon and the Lee and the salmon in them, and was hooked.
Right, and that is from
yes.
there.
So then, completing my BSc, we were allowed to choose one vertebrate group, and I chose fishes, and one invertebrate group as well, and I chose echinoderms, which are starfish and sea urchins and things.
Wow.
Yeah, so they were my two specialities.
Wow. It's great. And then everything else is histories from that point on. You just went in.
Yes, because my PhD was on hybrid fishes, which are crosses between species.
Oh, wow.
And the major one was salmon and trout hybrids, crosses between salmon and trout. The idea there was that the hybrids between salmon and trout and other species would have greater fitness than the individual species.
Oh, wow.
But this actually doesn't work. This came from crossing inbred plant lines. And if you cross two plant lines, you get a more vigorous individual.
But the fish are not plants.
But fish are not plants, and they're not. It's very difficult to inbreed them without high mortality. And
they're not fertile, right?
Yeah, they are fertile in the first generation. Interestingly, the second generation has low fertility or no fertility. But some hybrids, like mules, but the hybrid between horses and donkeys, are sterile. Yes. But if you do it the other way around, with the horse as the mother, I think.
Yeah, I always get it wrong.
Yes. They are fertile. But as we used to tell the students, mules, of course, are very fit in the sense that they're very good at climbing up mountains and things, but they're not fit in the reproductive sense, the Darwinian reproduction sense.
It sparked my interest. So those fish, those hybrid fish, are they... is it occurring naturally?
It's occurring naturally. If you electrofish in a river for small fry of salmon and trout, you get about 1% hybrids between salmon and trout.
Wow.
So at the end of the trout spawning season, which is usually in November, and the beginning of the salmon season, which is in December, you get a certain amount of overlap.
Wow, that's very interesting.
It's usually male trout with female salmon, I think, is
Wow.
mostly.
It's just we just started with like absolute. Listen, so we're gonna talk about salmon and salmonids fish. So just for the completeness sake and for these, I suppose, section of our listeners who are might be not aware, would you mind to explain what's special about salmon? What's their life cycle and how does that work? I'm sure that a lot of listeners already know that, but I'm sure there's also some people that don't know that, and I just want this podcast to be completed. So let's start from the basics.
Okay, Atlantic salmon, salmosalar, that we work on mainly, occurs in the North Atlantic, naturally in the North Atlantic. It occurs from Spain north to Western Russia, in the east, and also in the Baltic, in Iceland, in one river in Greenland, and then from Maine to Labrador in the west, in North America. In general, salmon are what they call anadromous. They grow up, they spawn and grow up in fresh water, and they go to the sea to feed and grow. So in Ireland, they will spawn in freshwater streams, and they will spend 2 years in the stream or lakes on the river system and grow to about 13, 14 centimeters long. And at that stage in the spring, they will silver up and go to sea. And they will spend between 1 and 3 years at sea. Yes. In general, before they come back to spawn. So they'll come back after 1 year and they'll weigh about 3 kilos and be about 60 centimeters long. Or if they spend 2 years at sea, they will be much bigger. They'll be about 7 kilos and maybe up to 100 centimeters long.
And what decides whether, like, what factor decides whether they spend a year or 2 years?
It seems to be underlying it is probably genetics, but there is also a question of whether your circulating sex hormones are at a particular level. If they're at a high enough level or above a threshold, the fish will come back to spawn. If they're at a lower level, the fish will spend another year at sea.
Okay.
And in general, we now know that the route at sea is to go north from Ireland and Scotland, along the coast of Norway, to the area around the Lofoten Islands. And then if they spend another year at sea, they go across to West Greenland. So they're taking a route north and then a route west if they spend a second year. If they come back to Ireland, they come back due south again.
Okay. And so that life strategy is to take the advantage of the food resources in the ocean. Is that
Yes.
Okay.
So they can spend their entire life in fresh water, and so a minority of salmon do, but they don't grow as big.
Yeah.
Although interestingly, places like the Baltic, which is brackish water, it's not full salinity.
Yes.
They grow quite big as well.
Yeah.
And maybe again, there's a physiological reason for this, that they have less energetic problems living in water. A third
I think that
salinity.
just the food abundance is bigger.
Yeah.
Huh. And tell me, so is Atlantic salmon, is it spawning only on rivers on the eastern side of the Atlantic?
No, both east and west.
And west, so Canada as well.
Yes, absolutely. There are huge numbers of salmon in the rivers in Labrador, because there aren't that many people and as many problems in Labrador. And with climate change, the populations in rivers in the south of both continents are having more and more problems.
Yes,
and they're going extinct, and it's too warm going to the ocean, or it's too warm when they come to the ocean.
Yes, and there are also few species of salmon in Pacific.
There are at least 5 species.
Yes.
They're known as genus Oncorhynchus, which means hook jaw.
Yes.
And the rainbow trout actually is one of these as well. The rainbow trout is a Pacific salmonid, which has been introduced to the eastern North America first, and then to Denmark, and finally to other areas.
Oh wow! I knew it was introduced, but I never knew it's one of those hook jaws.
Yes.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
And so on the Pacific, there's, like you said, there's many species. There's sockeye,
there's sockeye, Chinook, coho, chum, and pink.
Thank you.
And there's also a thing called cherry salmon, masu salmon in Japan on the eastern side or the western side of the Pacific.
Okay. And so is there a reason that we have only one species of salmon in Atlantic? Were they more and they went extinct, or?
That's interesting. Maybe the origin of the salmonids is in the Pacific, and they spread from there at climatic optima into the Atlantic. But I don't think anybody is absolutely sure of that. You know, certain people have worked on the evolution of the salmonids. That's not an area I'm very familiar with.
Yeah. Okay. No, but that makes sense. That's why we have that species of salmon.
Yes.
And okay, so we have that introduction. We know, and obviously salmon it's an iconic fish. It has a huge importance from the economic standpoint, and it has a huge importance from the standpoint of ecology, and is also very praised trophy fish by anglers. And that obviously brings us to something. Well, if if the fish is so valuable, then probably the wild stocks are in trouble, right?
Yes.
And unfortunately, that's kind of the theme that is occurring over and over again. Whether you're talking about, essentially any type of wildlife, that we losing them. How the situation looks like right now for salmon? Is it like are they in a rapid decline? Are they like, sable?
Talking about the Irish situation and possibly the whole European situation, there used to be quite a bit of coastal netting, and this was catching 4/5, 80% of the salmon coming back. 80% of the salmon coming back to places like Ireland. Now, this coastal fishing was stopped about 10, 12 years ago. And there was a hope then that a large number of salmon would come into the rivers. But that hasn't really happened. We've talked about a whole series of problems with the salmon in freshwater and in the sea. And it's like this idea of death by 1,000 cuts. Each one contributes to the decline. And in freshwater, the problems are things like silting up of the gravel that they spawn in. If you have, for example, unfenced edges of the river and cattle go down to drink regularly, they release silt into the river, which goes down into the crevices of the gravel, which need to be clear to allow oxygenated water to move to the eggs. And this clogs them up and suffocates the eggs. Now, it can happen in a human sense where you have a quarry on a river, like the River Bride that runs by us here, and they have quarries on it, and the quarries produce silt as well. So that's one of the things. And then you have problems with increased numbers of predators on the river. Possibly otters are conserved. A lot of birds, cormorants, come inland and feed on salmon fry. There's a problem as well of a conflict between how many trout you have in a river and how many salmon you have in a river.
You mean like introduced trout?
No. These are brown trout. These are ordinary native trout. And they compete with each other a little bit.
Yes.
And then going to sea, you have a problem with various piscivorous fish like pollock and that eat them. You have more and more seals, because these are a conserved species as well. And then they go off to sea, and there are areas in the ocean going north now that have nothing, no plankton to feed on. Now, we don't really know whether these were all, it was areas of low productivity, but they certainly are now. So the fish are going through these areas, and they're getting thinner and thinner, and that increases the likelihood of mortality. And this is not considering humans for a moment. And then they head into the areas, and for example, with global warming around West Greenland, you have more and more ice melt. The ice melt is doing two things to the ocean. It's making it colder and fresher.
Yes.
Lower salinity. And both of these decrease the number of prey species like capelin and so on that they feed on, sardine-like fish. And so the salmon don't have as much to feed on in those areas. And then they're coming back to Ireland and running the gauntlet of lots of seals, sharks, nets, etc., etc.
Wow.
Now, the salmon farming is another big problem because you at the moment over 2 million tons of salmon are being produced, Atlantic salmon,
and this is
cages.
This is kind of counterintuitive to many people, because they would think like the salmon farming should be good for salmon population, because you're not catching wild salmon, you're farming salmon. But it's the opposite.
In the sense of what you buy in the supermarket, it's good, because when you buy salmon, they're usually farm salmon.
But on that note, I know I have a friend who's an ichthyologist, and he used to work in salmon farms.
Yes.
And I was on the boat with him one day fishing, and he said, "I'm not eating salmon." And the skipper of the boat is like, "Why?" "Because you see all the shite that goes into them." And he says, "Exactly." He's like, "I'm not eating salmon." Well,
I don't totally agree, because I have worked in freshwater hatcheries a lot, and been to a lot of sea cages, and the food that they're given is basically capelin meal, it's fish meal and fish oil. Now, there is an effort to replace the fish meal and fish oil with plant-based materials. But at the moment, they're basically being fed what they would feed on in the wild. But it's been processed, it's been dried and extruded. Like breakfast cereals are.
And isn't that the problem exactly, that it's like someone put it, it's not producing more fish, it's converting one fish to another fish.
Exactly.
Because that fish that goes to feed farmed salmon are wild caught fish.
Yes. And basically what you're doing is converting a cheap fish species into a more expensive one.
Yes.
So that's, but at the same time, with increasing human population, you have to produce food in certain ways. And my feeling is that salmon farming in ways is less damaging than some of the land farming.
Right. Oh, that's interesting point. Can we explore that a little bit? Because you don't have attitude that the salmon farming is all bad.
From an economic point of view, if you consider that rather than a biological point of view for a moment, it's good, because, for example, the second largest industry in Norway now is salmon farming after oil. And it has meant that the whole coastal area of Norway, 2,000-3,000 kilometers, is remaining populated. So people are in these areas and not all crowded together in Oslo. So they can make a living and they can live in these areas, and that is good. From a biological point of view, there are problems then. There's pollution from the cages, there's pollution on the bottom, there's pollution in the water column. There is disease transmission, because basically you can have a disease outbreak that you can control inside a cage with antibiotics.
Yeah,
but if these fish escape then carrying this disease, they can pass it on to wild populations.
Yeah.
And there's a genetic problem then, which is my particular area of interest at the moment, where fish escape from cages and they're a lot less fit in the wild because they've grown up in a hatchery and they're used to being fed and so on. And it's amazing how quickly they call it hatchery selection. Really, it's the release of natural selection. And the Americans call farmed salmon big dumb fish.
Yeah.
That's basically, you want them to grow very fast, but they're no good in the wild.
Yes.
And when they escape into the wild, they can go to the Faroe Islands and to Greenland and come back into the rivers, and they can interbreed with the wild populations. And you have a decrease in productivity in rivers. They're less fit. Farm fish, we reckon, are less than 10% lifetime reproductive success. That is from egg to the next egg of wild fish. And the hybrids in between farm fish and wild fish of the same species here are intermediate. They're maybe 30% as fit as the wild.
So that brings me to interesting question. What is a mechanism for salmon to come back to the river? Because like a traditional, well, maybe not traditional wisdom, but what I heard is like the fish comes back to the river where he fish was born, right?
That's natal homing.
Yes, but now if you're talking about fish that is escaped from the cage, like how that fish knows where to come back and how does that happen?
Well, let's take the native populations. I mean, during the Ice Age, there were no salmon in Ireland, for example. And then they came back to the various rivers as the ice receded. And they became established in their own river. So each river has its own native population that's pretty well adapted to that river. Like the Blackwater, the Bandon, the Lee, and so on, will each have their own, and they're also a bit genetically different from each other.
Wow. Which
allows us to type individual rivers. But that's another point. But in any case, they go to sea, and they seem to have a sort of genetic map of where they're going to go. Maybe travel north and so on, and then if your gonads aren't big enough, travel west after a year. So they may be using sighting on the moon and the sun and so on, moving that way. But they remember the odor of the river, specifically of their home place.
Wow.
And when they're on their way back to the Irish coast, maybe they will use sort of visual migration on their way back, playing the tape back, if you like. But then as they get close to their home area, they begin to use the sense of smell. So they distinguish their home area by the sense of smell, and they can come back to the same tributary and the same spawning area as their mother and grandmother and so on spawned in.
Yes.
So that's the native ones. Now, the farmed ones, they'll have come from wild populations maybe 10 generations ago.
Yes.
And they will have lost maybe some of this migratory ability. But what they seem to do is follow wild fish. And they're less accurate at coming back. It depends on when they escape as well. If they escape very soon after they get into the cages, they seem to have less homing ability than later on. But again, we don't really know because nobody has tracked these things accurately in the ocean.
You could think about like where this particular salmon come from, what area naturally, and then if it escapes, is it gonna come? It's like, but I can't even begin to think how research like that could happen. But
the interesting thing is that the majority of salmon in Ireland, or the vast majority of farmed salmon, are of Norwegian origin. and yet if they escape, they come back to Ireland rather than Norway.
Right.
So that
because they follow.
Yes, they must be following.
Yeah. But then, from time to time, they have to get it wrong because otherwise they would never kind of get into the new rivers.
That's right, yes.
So that mechanism is not 100%, but then they clearly can adapt to a new river.
Yes, and they can. And you've touched on a point. Obviously, the native populations were in that situation when they were coming back after the ice receded.
Yes.
But what seems to happen, it's like barrel filling. A population builds up in a particular river, and eventually then they're adapted to that river, and less go into other rivers. So that it's advantageous to go back to your native river.
Yeah. Let's go back to salmon farming. So in general, the net result is negative on population. I'm taking is that
on wild populations, it's negative. Norway is the biggest salmon farming nation in the world. Atlantic salmon. Incidentally, Atlantic salmon seem to be the best species of salmonid for farming. So in Chile and Western Canada, where they're also farming salmon, they're farming Atlantic salmon. And the Chileans don't seem to worry so much because there are no salmonids in the southern hemisphere. There's a small species called galaxid instead of salmonids. So they're not so concerned about salmon escaping. And they say it starts an angling fishery and so on in the rivers. Whereas in Western Canada, they are extremely concerned. They're saying, really, we don't want these Atlantic salmon in our waters
because they all have native.
They have native they have diseases that they brought from other areas, and that the oncorhynchids in the place will be susceptible to. And there's a whole lot of almost arguments, philosophical arguments without evidence, but it's difficult to collect the necessary evidence.
And so you're saying that the other species of salmon are not being farmed, like they
have tried. There's a thing that goes on with salmon, which is called salmon ranching, which the ESB do here on rivers where they've built dams, like the River Lee down here. They built a dam, and that means they've cut off most salmon from going to the upper areas around Macroom and so on, and west of Macroom to spawn. They have a fish pass, a fish lift on the dam, which is partially successful. But they built a big hatchery up at Carrigrihid to replace the salmon they'd taken out. Now, I think 2/3 of those salmon, the original broodstock for the hatchery, came from the River Bride, which flows right by us here, and 1/3 from the River Shannon. So there's a mixture of these, and they're put in as hatchery fish, and they're grown up in the hatchery to smolt size. 2 years, even 1 year now it takes, because you can grow them faster with feeding all the time in the hatchery, and then they're released. And these fish come back, and that is known as salmon ranching.
So they're like semi-wild.
That is semi-wild, and that is an intermediate stage between native salmon and farm salmon. Farm salmon is a totally closed cycle. There's a freshwater hatchery, then they go into a sea cage. And if you're a salmon farmer, you don't want escapes, because money is escaping out of your cage. But ranching is something in between. And ranching is generally not very favorable, but
in what sense?
In the sense that the ranch fish, if they spawn in the wild, they produce progeny which are a bit less successful, less fit than the wild ones, because evolution is going on all the time. One of the things we realize as biologists, maybe in my time as a biologist, is that evolution can move very, very fast. Now, it obviously takes several generations, but it's not several thousand generations. It can move fast. And it's going on all the time.
So is the salmon ranching kind of idea to kind of connect the need for conservation of wild stocks and at the same time have some fish for commercial use? Is that the idea?
Well, take the Lee now. There's some netting goes on, draft netting down near Blackrock Castle in Lochmahan. And so there are a few commercial fishermen still involved in this. And then there's a whole series of angling clubs on the River Lee that are catching salmon.
Yes.
And then one hopes that enough salmon escape back to the hatchery to be used as broodstock for the next generation. Okay. So it's a self-sustaining thing, but I'm not sure it's the best way of rehabilitating the Lee.
Yes. It doesn't sound. So just to finish off on I have two more questions on salmon farming. In general, as a biologist and taking into account conservation, would you like to see, like, if you're a emperor of the world, would you like to see end of salmon farming? Or do you think that if we get rid of salmon farming, then wild fish are toast because they're all going to get caught?
I think with population sizes and the economic need to keep populations in coastal areas, you probably need to keep salmon farming or aquaculture in general going on. The thing with salmon that you would prevent escapes and disease transmission is if you could farm them in land tanks with seawater. Wow. But the problem there is that it costs at least twice as much to produce a kilo of salmon at the moment in a tank on land than it is.
Plus you're catching all the fish as
huge pumping costs, and then you've got fouling of algae, seaweeds, and all sorts of things. And you've got a build-up of pollution. How are you going to get rid of waste food and feces?
Yeah. So actually it's no better because you still have the same problem.
It would be good, and some of the German supermarkets are setting up fish farms, total recirculation fish farms right next to them in the middle of Germany, 1,000 kilometers away from the sea.
Wow.
But they're farming fish that are easier to farm at the moment, like tilapia and eels. So that salmon would be more difficult to do.
That's interesting. So what would be the way to kind of improve salmon farming, like in the cages in the sea? Because I'm taking from this conversation that, well, we need to do that because otherwise, if we want to have any chance of actually still have a wild salmon.
Yes.
But then, like you said, this problem with the disease, problem with all the waste and everything is there a way of actually dealing with that, or is it like a situation with no?
Well, one
solution?
specialist on mammals, cows and sheep and goats and so on, said that as soon as you domesticate a species, it goes extinct in the wild. And he was thinking in terms of wild cattle, aurochs and things like that, wild sheep.
That's interesting.
Wild goats. But they're making an effort, as they say in Norway. I know the people on both sides involved. Nina, the nature management organization in Norway, their imperative is to preserve wild salmon populations.
Yes.
And to separate them as much as possible from the farms. Now, there's a huge farming industry as well. And they have initiatives, for example, like vaccinating fish against diseases so they don't have disease when there are not disease outbreaks in the cages. That would be an important thing. They also have a thing called, probably my pronunciation is wrong, but it's Das Nos Veritas, which is matching your equipment to the conditions. In other words, if you have a very exposed location, you have very strong moorings on the cages, and you have very strong cages and so on that are not broken up by winter storms.
Yes.
And which is the major reason for escapes. In fact. So all of these things, as I say, salmon farmers want to keep the salmon in the cages.
Yeah.
And they want to control disease outbreaks. And one of the problems about salmon farming, as farming anything, is that if you have your stocking density very high, and that economically that's a good idea, but disease transmission wise, it's not.
Disaster.
They know it as the ghetto effect, where you have very rapid transmission, where you crowd a lot of any species, including humans, into an area. Diseases move very, very fast.
Yeah. So, are you aware of the issue of wrasse and catching wild wrasse? Can you tell us a few words about that?
Yes. Wild wrasse of various species. I think there's 4 species: ballon, corkwing, and cuckoo in Ireland, and I've forgotten what the fourth one is. But they eat sea lice from salmon, provided
in the wild as well.
No, that's an interesting one.
Okay.
Because I'm not sure whether, in tropical areas you've seen these ideas of manta rays and cleaning stations and things.
Exactly.
Now, I don't know whether that happens in the wild. That's a good question.
Exactly, because the wrasse is kind of close to the rocks and close to the structure.
Yes, it is, yes.
While salmon is a fish free swimming. Is it called pelagic? Yes.
And the wrasse are extremely territorial.
Yeah.
And they require little things like pigeon coops in the salmon cages that they live in. And they come out and they preferentially eat the sea lice from the salmon. But if there isn't enough salmon food around, or if the wrasse are insufficiently fed, they start picking at salmon eyes and things, which is not particularly good. The other thing that wrasse has been a problem with wrasse is that they carry one of the diseases that they transmit to salmon.
Okay.
So the other species that they use as a cleaner are lump suckers. So in Bantry now, where we're involved with, they have a hatchery that's producing hundreds of thousands of lump suckers.
Wow.
To sell to the farming industry to use as cleaner fish.
Wow.
Now, theoretically, using cleaner fish is better than using chemicals to control something. But you've always got to consider the problems that you may be bringing in by using the cleaner fish. I mean, you know about what they call biological control all around the world, where prickly pear cactus, for example, was introduced into Australia, or Pontia was introduced, and they keep trying to introduce things that will kill the plant. So they look extensively in South Africa for species that will feed on it.
I think that Australia is really like a mess, and it comes to that, because they have the rabbits,
the cane toad, and the rabbit. Well, the rabbit is brought in for food and hunting. But they've brought in red fox as well.
Fox, yes.
Yes, and they brought in ordinary deer, red deer. In New Zealand are a big problem. Opossums in New Zealand, which have been introduced from Australia.
Everything they could, bring it on the ships and brought it over. And now it's like, whoa, like a native population.
And with British colonization of these areas, they wanted salmon and trout in their rivers, and they wanted red fox to hunt. Then rabbits for the red fox to feed on.
Oh man! So going back to wrasse, and have you heard, or have you have any information about the impacts on the wild wrasse population? Because I know that was kind of like a big deal, and recently that
there was an article in the Sunday Times the week before last about wrasse, and they were saying that one of the big salmon farming companies which is largely Norwegian based, but they have farms in Scotland and Ireland. They had been taking a lot of wild wrasse from their local areas.
Yes.
Now, I don't know the facts of this, facts and figures. It would be interesting to have the exact facts and figures. However, in the same article, they then said they were talking about lump suckers, and they were saying that people were taking lump suckers. Salmon farms were paying fishermen to catch lump suckers, and they would introduce them into the cages. But they were saying that in Bantry, for example, in the hatcheries, they're producing hundreds of thousands of lump suckers. But that doesn't mean that you have hundreds of thousands of broodstock, because, as you know, a fish produces a huge number of eggs.
Yes.
The average salmon, 60 centimeters long, will produce about 3,000 eggs.
Yeah.
So there's a multiplication effect. There's also, of course, a mortality effect. So if you're studying a salmon population, what you do is saying, is there, well, it's a 1 to 2 because there's males and females, but is each female producing one female that's reproductively capable in the next generation or not? And unfortunately, for many, many years, we've been below that sustainable level. Both because of freshwater problems, which you can do something about. You can stop, you can put a fence at the edge of a river and prevent cattle from getting down all over the place. You can maybe move predators to somewhere else and so on. But I have found in dealing with salmon anglers that they're rather concerned only about one species, only about salmon. And they're saying sort of, we don't really care about otters, cormorants, anything else. It's just, let's get more salmon.
Doesn't work that way.
But I think you have to have a general conservation idea. And also, I gave a talk on salmon in Killarney about 12 months ago. And there were a lot of anglers there, and they were saying, well, we don't want salmon farming. But does that mean you don't want people to live in these areas? Because fishing as an activity is declining as well because of overfishing, as you know. And so how are you going to maintain jobs in these areas?
It's interesting because you're very, very conservation minded, but you also take into account of actually people and the economy, which is kind of fresh approach, because you're not like a one-dimensional. You're looking at the whole thing.
But if you're part of a pressure group pushing conservation, you have to be extreme. But I think you have to consider all the aspects. If you're in the middle and somebody is asking you.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, just to finish off with salmon farming, one last thing I gotta ask you about is, what are your views about welfare of salmon? Because you mentioned that they kind of the density is very high, and I even heard expression that if the salmon farming in the current shape is allowed only because it's underwater, if the pig farming or any other farming that's going on the land look like salmon farming, it will be banned in 24 hours. What are your views on that?
Certainly, when salmon farming began in the 1960s in Norway, there were small cages inshore, sometimes right on the coast, stockades, basically. And the fish were crowded together and they couldn't swim around much. However, these big cages, 50-meter diameter Bridgestone cages, and derivatives that have a rubber edge to the cage, and the cage hangs down from that, and they move with the waves. The salmon in those swim a lot. And they swim as they would in the open ocean. Now, they swim in circles, of course, rather than straight lines. But I don't think would grow properly if they weren't in reasonably good physical conditions.
Yeah.
And okay, you could say maybe they're only growing because they're given a huge amount of feed and they have no effort to get the feed. But if you go out to these salmon cages, the salmon seem to jump happily and swim happily. And if you dive in these cages, I've seen lots and lots of, I haven't dived in a cage myself, but I've seen lots of videos of it. And the salmon seem to be moving relatively happily. So as the industry goes bigger and more offshore, the salmon are in better physical condition.
Yes.
And in fact, there was one French farm that used to, this was many years ago, that used to claim that their individual salmon had swum 3,000 kilometers, for example, in their lifetime.
Wow.
And the idea was that the further they swim, the better condition they're in.
Yes.
And if you look at farm salmon now, phenotypically, appearance-wise, they're very similar to wild salmon. The fins are in good shape. They're long and slender. You get better flesh quality if the fish swim a lot.
Yes, there's no doubt.
Yeah. So that it's the industry try to get more and more fit fish swimming.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in other words, those pictures that we see in the news of salmon with the rubbed off skin and all that, this is kind of, I'm taking from you, like outliers. It obviously happens some places, but it's not a common thing.
It happens particularly when you have a big sea louse outbreak. The sea lice feed on the mucus and scales, and then they expose the underlying dermis. They can do this.
Yes.
But the farmers try to control sea lice outbreaks by coordinating chemical treatments within a bay, for example.
Yes.
And it's called single bay management. And they can, to an extent, control it. They can't eliminate the problem.
Yes, of course.
But it is controlled. And as I say, the idea is to have of the very best fillet quality you can.
Yeah.
It's an animal production method. And I mean, you may say you don't like animal production. But if you're going to do it, you need to do it in the most humane way possible.
Yes.
And there are a lot of people looking at animal welfare in this. Now, I suspect that it's harder to know whether a fish is happy than whether a cow is happy.
Yeah. That's no doubt.
That's another thing.
You mentioned that those cages are moving more offshore.
Yes.
Is that what you? Is that again the problem for the wild population?
It is if it means that there are more escapes.
Okay.
And it can be a problem for wild trout, sea trout, that go to sea. Because you've probably heard about the controversy that's going on in Ireland about decline of sea trout.
Please lay it out to us.
Okay. Sea trout do more or less the same thing as salmon. They all spawn in fresh water. But trout are different to salmon in that they have an option of either staying in fresh water or going to sea. And if some of the population in a river goes to sea, they're known as sea trout.
Yeah.
They smoltify, they go silver at 2 or 3 years old, and they go to sea. And they come back. And these sea trout are often the ones the anglers are more interested in getting. Because they go to sea, they usually grow bigger. And so the angling effort in lots of rivers is on sea trout rather than on brown trout, which are the trout that stay in the rivers. There's a book on sea trout called The Child of the Tides. Sea trout don't do the same thing as salmon. When they go to sea, they hang around the Irish coast. They don't go off to West Greenland, the Faroes and West Greenland. And hanging around in that area, the edge of the tide, they encounter lots of sea lice that have come from salmon farms, from treatment of salmon farms. So basically you have a nasty combination of where the trout are and where the sea lice are. And so the sea lice can build up on the trout then, and you have more and more of these migratory fish being killed off.
Yes.
They're coming back prematurely to the rivers with basically holes in their gills that allow fresh water to go in, and etc., etc. Secondary diseases that are caused. So certainly salmon farming is not good for trout, sea trout. In fact, it probably causes more problems for sea trout than it does for wild salmon, although that's a debatable one as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. What do you think? Like, what's the future? Where with the we gonna is it that we're gonna find like a happy medium between farming enough salmon to satisfy the market needs and at the same time mitigate the problems with, or is it we will run out of wild salmon eventually?
Well, at this stage the wild salmon are there may be a couple of 100 tons of wild salmon are caught in the whole North Atlantic now, and the farm salmon industry is millions of tons, up to 2 million tons. So there are far more farm salmon than there are wild salmon.
Yes,
now,
that's no doubt.
Whether we can stop the decline of the wild salmon is anybody's guess. There are other reasons for the decline, obviously, as
like
I said. Even if farming wasn't there, you would, I think, have problems and decline. And basically, you can't change, well, you can change climate change, but you can't change it at a local area. You can't go out and do anything to help the salmon in the sea. Salmon farming will continue, I think, if it's economically viable. We used to run a master's in aquaculture in UCC, and the first thing we used to say to the students was, with any species, there are two considerations. A, can you grow it? That's a biological imperative. And B, can you sell it at a profit? That's the economic imperative. And there is no point if you can't sell it.
Yes.
And you won't get investors coming in. And there is quite a bit of money. You can imagine in the million tons of salmon at about €1,000 a ton. That's a big industry. And a lot of banks must be bankrolling this and so on. If you would like to give it, because obviously you can also buy wild salmon, and some people think that the wild caught salmon is much better from the nutrition standpoint than the farmed salmon. If you were to advise someone from the conservation standpoint, right? There's a person who is really into saving salmon. Would you say that it's better if you buy farm salmon? It's better if you buy wild caught salmon? Or maybe you should take a rod and line and cut one yourself? Which in your view would be? I would say nutrition-wise, you're probably right, and probably wild salmon is slightly better. I don't think there's a huge difference, but that aside, you are better buying farm salmon, but you're taking the pressure off the wild.
Right. Even knowing the impact of the farming, the pressure, taking out the pressure is.
I mean, you know that in supermarkets there's a thing called Donegal catch salmon available. And I was out with an angling skipper in Cork Harbour, and we were talking about Donegal catch, and he said they're neither from Donegal nor caught.
Okay.
They're farm salmon.
Yes.
Well, no, they might be from Donegal, but they're actually probably filleted in Poland.
Yes.
Yes.
Speaking about Poland, you can buy a Baltic salmon, wild caught, and farmed salmon, and the flesh is quite different.
Yes.
It's like a first of all, it's not pink, it's or orange or whatever color is like the one that you're buying. It's literally different fish. And this is like a wild caught salmon. You can only get in a certain time of the year. Obviously, the price is 4 times the price of the farmed salmon, and so on and so forth. So you can do that, but you would say buy the farmed one if you worry about salmon stocks.
Yeah, I think I would. Yes. Yeah. The reason, incidentally, that color of farmed salmon, if you're feeding them on fish meal all the time, they will not be pink or not be orange or whatever. So they put in a natural pigment in the salmon food called anthocyanin. And the anthocyanin is what you get naturally in crustaceans like shrimp and prawns and so on, which the salmon feed on initially when they go to sea. And that's why they're coloured. And then they have a mixed diet, more fish later on. But they feed this to the salmon. Now, they used to use a synthetic pigment a number of years ago, but there's a more natural pigment now. And this actually, incidentally, is the most expensive component of salmon food.
I'm glad you said that, because I heard that about, kind of coloring salmon, and now you kind of confirm that this is really what's going on.
Oh, it is,
and this is the most expensive, like you said, part of the salmon feed. Okay, that's very interesting. Can we have a green salmon or something?
No, I don't think so. That would be a long dead salmon, probably.
Yeah, other than the dead one. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about angling and anglers. From your experience, what is the impact of anglers, recreational anglers, and what is their role in general, or what could be their role in general when it comes to wild salmon?
No, I think anglers are very good first in that they're custodians of the local area.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you said it.
And they look for poaching. They look for pollution sources. They're out on the rivers. We don't have enough river inspectors because basically it's a cost-benefit analysis and how many can you put out. These guys work very hard. The river inspectors work very, very hard. They mostly work for the Inland Fisheries Ireland, IFI. And
I even have an episode of a podcast with one of the inspectors. Bernie Brosnan. I don't remember what number of a podcast was it. I'm going to put it in the description of the podcast, when he was exactly talking about, waking up at 4 a.m. and going, onto the river and checking, for illegal nets, and it's quite interesting episode. So if you
but then the question is, well, what proportion of the salmon coming into the river do the anglers catch? If you're lake fishing, if you have lakes on a river, and we have detailed information for the last 70 years on the Borrasool system in County Mayo, where I used to work, the anglers are taking about 10% of the stock. So those fish that come into fresh water, the anglers take 10%, and the other 90% go to spawn naturally. So that's about the figure. However, on some rivers, in particular low water conditions where they can't get up a weir and people are fishing it very hard below the weir, the exploitation levels can be 80%. I think there's figures from the River Wye in Wales and England showing that there's very heavy angling exploitation.
Wow.
And the thing is that anglers want to catch bigger salmon. They want to catch large salmon, so they 5 kilos and more. And so they concentrate on what are known as the spring fish, the fish that come back in the spring. And they're less interested in the smaller salmon, the grills, that come back later.
But overall, would you say that because obviously the salmon angling is regulated in Ireland with the tag system and license and so on. overall, do you think it's a good system that works, or is it a system that requires some changes or improvements?
No, I think it's a good system that works. And I think controlling exploitation is a good idea, because a number of years ago we were involved with the Blackwater anglers and, well, the Blackwater salmon managers, and hearing that I think half of the salmon that were caught that year on the rod and line were caught by 3 guys commercially fishing up on the top of the Blackwater, and they were fishing day and night, and they were selling the fish they caught.
But there's a
now this
number...
was before the tags.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And so that is a very good measure. Again, catch and release is hard to gauge. It causes more mortality, but it allows some fish to get to spawn.
Yeah, because survival rate is not 100%. That was, I was checking that was episode 51 when we were talking about illegal salmon netting, and maybe that's something I'm going to ask you. What is in your view the impact of the illegal netting that's going? Is that the major problem in your view for wild salmon population?
No, I don't know the figures. I mean, prior to the banning of drift netting in the ocean, and it was coastal drift nets. The coastal drift nets could take up to 90% of the salmon returning to the Irish coast. So coastal drift netting historically has always been allowed in Donegal, and then it was extended to the rest of Ireland. And then 10 years ago, as I say, or about 10 years ago, it was stopped. So that's what drift netting, coastal drift netting. And there was also netting going on at the Faroes and West Greenland in the oceans. And that has been intermittently banned as well, because that was taking a lot of fish, half-grown fish, basically. Now, you still have draft netting going on in the rivers. This is where you essentially seine net. You pass the net around some individuals and pull them in. And that has a lower impact. That has probably comparable impact to the angling. Now, it varies locally. It depends on whether you have a good drift netting station or not so good. There's draft netting going on above the bridge in the Blackwater. You know, the bridge that goes into County Waterford, the major road bridge. That area, there's draft netting going on, and essentially they're pretty good. They take about half the salmon that come back to the River Blackwater. It varies depending on the year.
But I'm taking you said you don't have a number, so you don't know whether like an illegal part of the
No, I don't. And the problem about illegal fishing is that you don't actually have accurate numbers.
Exactly, because like I'm just bringing that what I got with that conversation on the 51, that that gentleman I was interviewing, Bertie Brosnan, his name, he was saying like, well, climate change and all that is all good and well, but like you said, we can't do anything about it, like here in Ireland. But what we can do, at least we can limit the illegal take of the fish.
He's absolutely right. And I mean, there've been stories in rivers of nets going right across the river.
Yes, exactly. That's what he was saying, that the rivers essentially,
and using explosives and possibly using cyanide and so on. So all of these things, the more you can control it, and the more inspectors you can have on the ground, and these people are very, very well informed about who is likely to do it, because
exactly, that's what he was saying, that he knew exactly who they are, that he just need to have the proof. But he exactly knew who, when, where, and all that.
Yes. The point is that with illegal fishing, the illegal fishermen wouldn't catch any fish unless they were very knowledgeable. So they're a small component of the population, and the fishery inspectors usually know who these guys are.
Yes. Listen, you touched briefly on otters and cormorants, and that you mentioned that they are part of, like, so you mentioned these in two contexts. Maybe I'm just taking it wrong, because on one end you mentioned it as a part of the trouble for salmon. That
Yes.
but on the other hand, you mentioned, like, well, but they're part of the ecosystem, and if you want to talk about salmon conservation, you need to talk about everything, not only more so. Can you lay it out for us? What are the relation, and how does that work?
Well, for example, if you take grey seals,
Yes.
there is prohibition on culling seals, and you will get angling lobbies saying that there are 10 times more seals than there were. Certainly, there are teenage grey seals that seem to come down the Irish coast in the spring and eat a lot of salmon smokes on the way out. But it seems to be a question of balance.
Yes.
Balance between any predator like this. Otters you want to reintroduce into waters, but they are going to, by definition, eat fish.
Yeah.
And what are you going to get them to eat?
Farmed salmon.
Yeah, well, in fact, seals and otters, they keep as far away from farms as possible.
Really?
Yeah, they have.
I would thought they're gonna try to break in.
They do try to break in, and they have these electric fences around farms, which are about 10 centimeters from the ground, so that an otter encounters them if they try to get in. And you have predator nets on your ponds in freshwater, which is basically a net on top of a tank.
Yeah.
And herons in particular are very clever. They learn to bounce on these nets. They go in an area and they bounce up and down, and they get into a place where they can stick their beak through and grab a fish.
Wow.
And cormorants in the sea, then they seals are kept away from sea cages by what are called predator nets, which are a veil of nets of wider mesh, a meter outside the net cage that keeps the fish in.
Yes.
So basically, your predator is kept at least a meter away. Now, unless there's a tear in either net.
Yeah. Does it not pose the problem for those seals and other animals getting tangled, and surely there is a mortality?
It does, and particularly cetaceans, dolphins and porpoises and whales are getting caught in. Well, they're getting hit by ships, and they're getting caught in fishing gear and so on.
Yeah.
There's a big conservation effort going on in Maine to design lobster pots and the buoys and the ropes from these to avoid entangling whales and dolphins that come through.
Yeah.
But conservation to maintain biodiversity as far as you can, I think, needs to look at all species.
Yes.
Rather than... Now, I quite understand why salmon anglers will look just at salmon, because they want...
Yeah, I guess.
The most salmon possible.
Well, on one end, yes, but then on the other end, I think that these are people who, especially now, I would expect higher level of understanding and a higher level of care about the environment as a whole, rather than I just want a lot of big fish and I don't care about anything else, right? Because then, well, go fish in a salmon farm tank, right? You'll catch big fish, and it's easy to catch.
This is like the rainbow trout put in take lakes. There's one near Dunmanway where the IFI stock rainbow trout in, and fishermen can angle on it and catch rainbow trout.
There is a lake Alua nearby in Cork.
Yes, right.
And there are trout cages.
Yes.
And I remember when we were fishing, going there fishing for pike, and that was the moment where significant number of these trout had to escape.
Yes.
And we noticed there's a guy standing on. He stopped his boat. He's like, "There's a trout everywhere," and he had like a 6 or 7 those rainbow trouts, and you could literally throw the bare hook
Yes.
And they were grabbing that bare hook, and
Yes,
you can. So we caught like a number of these trout. And I was
Yes.
like, well, okay, I guess we have dinner, you know.
Yes.
So
Interestingly, salmon farming began when it began. They used to farm rainbow trout at sea, and they would market them as sea trout, and they were
technically they were right.
They were a very nice product. They were very good, because when I worked in the Salmon Research Agency in Mayo from 1980 to 83, we used to buy these because they were half the price of salmon.
It's very interesting. That's very interesting. Okay, let's for 1 second. So go back to the predators and the seals and the like. Do you see any need to control the population of those other predators in order to help salmon? And I guess that's a legitimate question, because I know the efforts, for example, in, I don't remember, is it Canada or Alaska, where there is an issue of the killer whales or orcas that also feed on salmon.
Yes.
They're trying to do various things to help salmon and some other things. So I think it's a legitimate question, and a lot of people who are listening to this podcast, they're obviously environmentally minded, like, oh my God, calling seals is crazy. But is it crazy because you have this other
No, it probably isn't crazy, because we have altered environments. And certain species seem to have an advantage in altered environments, and other ones have a disadvantage.
Yes.
And we need to know enough about whether there are too many. I mean, there's an argument in Killarney as to whether there are too many red deer, for example.
Yes,
and whether there should be a cull of red deer.
They are. They are. Way too many deer. It's not natural. I believe you look at it, you see all those big.
But then maybe you could say there are too many sheep as well.
There probably is too many sheep. That's true too.
And they're not natural.
No.
I mean, incidentally, there's a big argument we worked on Killarney red deer at one stage, and there's an argument as to whether they are native or not. I define a native as something that got in naturally after the Ice Age. Whereas something introduced by man, hedgehogs are introduced by the Normans, for example.
Yes,
into Ireland.
That's very interesting, and I always bring in this argument. I think it was in Hawaii or where there are pigs that are non-native.
Yes,
and some native people saying like, well, they were already there when we came, so how we are native and they're not native.
Yes.
Right? So this is this point in time. At which point in time you decide that something is native versus it's not native?
And in Pacific Islands, I mean, pigs are a major item in the diet.
Yes, yes. They were left there by the whalers, I guess.
Yes, yeah.
Goats and pigs.
Pigs, yes, yeah.
I heard that also turtles were introduced on some of these islands.
Oh, really?
Yes. Because what was happening that they found out that the fresh meat is allowing to avoid this disease.
Yes.
Lack of vitamin C.
Yeah.
And
scurvy.
Scurvy, exactly. And what they found out that they took those turtles and flip them around, and they can stay alive for months, and provided like that's for
that is extremely cruel, but
animal welfare for you.
Yeah.
But this is what they were doing,
yes.
And this is why they were upside of sheeps and goats, and not sheep but goats and pigs. They were also putting turtles. Same logic as a source of food. So this is exactly that point. Are they native or non-native?
The trouble with culling things and so on is you need to have very good biological information on what's going on.
Exactly.
I mean, are there too many ants? Should we be culling ants?
Yeah. Good luck with that.
For example.
Yeah. Can you share anything that's maybe a little bit off topic, but on the subject of red deer in Killarney? How the situation looks like right now? Because I think that there's always not only biological arguments, but there are also emotional
No,
arguments.
I don't know enough about red deer to.
Okay. I just saw that, want to take an opportunity that.
I mean, some of the parks and wildlife people in Killarney could tell you much better about the situation with red deer.
Yeah, of course. I just wanted that maybe you heard them.
It's a question of what too many is and what impact they're having.
Yeah.
What they're eating, what they're competing with, what problems they're causing.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, it could be that you have too many of a species and that they're increasing mortality within the species itself because animals are starving because they don't have enough food resources or whatever.
Exactly.
But I don't know the details of the red deer. So,
and we're here to talk about salmon, not deer. So sorry about that, but I just had to.
I don't know.
Okay, so it is interesting because you're saying that it's probably looking at the population of other predators.
Yes.
Is it completely crazy idea if we serious about salmon conservation?
No, I think it's a good idea. But which government department is going to look at this? You see, maybe certain departments are responsible for land animals, and otters are considered. And then the Department of Marine is interested in salmon. You need people to get together and say, well, you really need somebody to look after conservation of biodiversity.
Yeah. And this is not happening.
No, it's not happening.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it appears to me from outside that there are these government departments which are vying with each other and they're looking after their own angle very efficiently.
Yes.
But nobody is taking an overall approach.
Exactly.
And you've got to say, well, okay, our human population is going to increase 50% in the next 20 years, 50 years. And what impact is that going to have on biodiversity? Because, I mean, you hear people talking about the three big challenges environmentally: climate change, plastics, and decrease in biodiversity. Now, there's obviously an overlap between these three things, but there's also different problems with each one. The plastic problem is possibly one you could deal with more easily. But then how much of, plastic bags, it's just very difficult to envisage a life without plastics.
Yeah.
And it's going to be, by definition, a more expensive life.
Yes.
And then,
well, it may be less wasteful.
Yes.
That's put it that way, because I think, and this is another argument that the rate at which we consume things seems to be, not related to the, if you look at your phone, right? You're supposed to change your phone every 2 years, period, right?
Yes.
And why?
Yes.
Right? It kind of like
to make more money for Apple.
Exactly. So a lot of things are aging morally. Like I heard that term, that it's morally aging. And if you have a Volkswagen Golf that is 15 years old or 20 years old, like fundamentally, it's not worse than the latest one.
So long as it's safe.
It takes you from A to B and so on, but it's more like, whoa, like what? You have like a 15-year-old car? What's wrong with you, right? You have this, and this has nothing to do with actual function.
And the fashion industry and clothes and so on is the worst of all.
Yeah.
Because there's all sorts of considerations like low price labor from Asia making these things. And then
Yes. Okay, listen, just to close off, what advice would you give to angler, your regular angler, concerned about salmon, concerned about sea trout? What you think what that person can do or should do to do his little bit to help situation?
I think an angler needs to know as much about their prey species, salmon or trout, as possible. So they need to learn as much about the thing as possible. And they need to consider other species in the environment, not just their salmon and trout. They are the two things.
Right.
I would say.
That's the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Okay. That's perfect. Tom, is there anything else that you think is worth mentioning that we didn't touch on?
I suppose a general thing, I am very keen looking at the role of biologists now to point out that probably they're a gamekeeper on unsustainable economic growth. They're looking at, one of the roles of biologists is to try and say, okay, you can do this and it will mean more jobs and more money for people, but the costs of doing this to the environment and to other species will be such and such. I think that's the role of biologists. And unfortunately, I think our politicians are short-term people. They're in for the 4-year. And basically, government departments are considering economics rather than taking a holistic approach. I think you need biologists and a lot of younger people. You know, you talk to teenagers and they're much more conservation conscious.
Yeah.
And
maybe because they're young and they're not bitter yet.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, but we get a lot of biology students really interested in animals and plants and the environment.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. You mentioned you touched on a very, very true thing that politics is only short term. It's like a 4-year, and like it's not only in conservation, it's not only in biology, but for example in fighting crime.
Yes.
You know, like I heard a podcast about fighting cartels in Mexico, and one of the top guys who were, you know, fighting with on the front line, he would say like, this is not successful because every next government has a different idea how to do it, and we setting up something, we start to have a little bit success, and then there's a new government and they have a different idea and we starting from scratch. So I guess that's a problem in general, that the system is a little broken with this cycle every 4 years, and then people gets upset about something else and we change everything. It's like, all right, now we have a better idea, and like, oh my god. So this
I am a bit depressed about politics, and because you know the communism didn't work, but I don't think capitalism works either. I heard a statistic yesterday that per capita Ireland is number 5 in millionaires per capita in the world.
Wow, number 5.
Number 5.
It's always interesting how they get that stat, you know, like, but yeah,
it is. Yeah, but I presume from rich lists and so on. So forth. They seem to have pretty accurate stats on people. When you see these rich lists, they say worth 235 million. It's should donate something for some conservation projects or something like that. Right? Yes, but I think people do this. You know, Bill Gates does a certain amount of this. And
certainly there are more and more. I think that in general we're becoming more aware about the problem.
Oh, absolutely.
Even, you know, one of the things is that people always want to change now.
Yes.
And the fact is that we, as a human species, we started to be aware of these things like a couple of decades ago.
Yes.
Right? So if you look at the history, it takes 200 years before we as a humanity move on and change something. And we just become aware of these things.
Yes.
So I am hopeful that the more we talk about it eventually we'll get there. Like whether it's not going to be too late for salmon and pandas, I don't know. But
yes, and I think Greta Thunberg is right. I mean, she's extreme, but she's right.
Hmm.
You know, Patrick and I were talking recently about the idea in one of Jared Diamond's books that Easter Island. Nobody came to their assistance when the population was declining.
Yeah.
And they had all these problems and so on. They'd eaten out their resources and there was warfare and so on.
Yeah.
But the world is a bit like, nobody's going to come to the assistance of the world. So it's up to the people within the world to improve things if they can.
Yeah. I always, I always find kind of reassuring thing that the planet and the natural world will be okay, which is human might just not be okay. But when I look at the programs, the really like a deep history, millions of years ago, and how it's all been changing, and when the first organisms start to produce oxygen, and there was like a major disaster for the planet because all of a sudden some organisms started to produce this arguably toxic gas.
It's a toxic gas,
right?
To anaerobes.
Exactly. And yet now, thanks to the oxygen, we have the planet we have, right? So like I see kind of analogy, we start producing a gas that is changing the environment, right? And we might end up on the receiving end of that situation, but overall the planet will be okay.
And during the Carboniferous, there was 30% oxygen in the atmosphere rather than 20%.
Yeah.
And there were huge numbers of fires. And incidentally, there were dragonflies with almost a meter wingspan. Because the size of insects is limited by the amount of oxygen.
Because they're not breathing. So
they're tracheal breathing.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Tom, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Okay, thank you, Tom.